The most successful coaches never stop learning. They are committed to their personal growth and making themselves better. I'm Colby Donovan, and welcome to the Coaching Coaches Podcast. I'll speak with the world's most respected coaches, best-selling authors, and top business leaders to give you insight into their philosophies, lessons, and mindsets for you to apply to your own life. Head on over to coachingcoaches.co, where you can subscribe to this podcast and join some of the top coaches around the country who also enjoy our regular newsletter. My guest today is Francesca Gino, a professor at Harvard Business School focused on why people make the decisions they do at work and how leaders and employees have more productive, creative, and fulfilling lives. Harvard's famous for their case studies being used by colleges and companies all over the world to teach, and when I saw she wrote a case study on Steve Kerr online, I had to get her on the podcast. Our conversation today starts with the lessons she learned from studying and talking to Coach Kerr to write the case study. Then we shift to the topic of her best-selling book, Rebel Talent, Why It Pays to Break Rules in Work and Life. She's one of the most impressive people I have ever talked to before, and if I haven't convinced you to listen yet, know that when we recorded, she had just finished a teaching session with an MBA staff on various topics. I am once again joined by Oliver Winterbone to co-host the episode with me. Oliver is the director of coaches and executives at Wasserman, one of the premier talent management companies in the world. Given Oliver's connectivity to current and former NBA head coaches, it was a blast to hear both of them kind of go back and forth with each other during the episode. Please enjoy this episode with Francesca Gino. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It is so great to be here.
So I remember a couple years ago or a year ago, I saw randomly a Harvard business case study on Steve Kerr floating around on Twitter and wondered, where in the heck is that coming from and who wrote that? And then we got in touch after that time.
Yeah, good question. I often go to strange contexts to gain insights that I believe are important for business or for all of us. And Coach Steve Kerr was definitely a very interesting person to learn from.
When did you originally come across him? And what kind of intrigued you to then go deep and write the whole case study on him?
I've been following him for a few years. I was intrigued by the fact that a person who had a lot of experience under his belt, that was the case for him when he decided to become a coach for the Warriors back in 2013, that before taking on that role, he did a lot of things that allowed him to learn more and prepare better for taking on that new role. So for 30 years, he had been a basketball player. He was a broadcaster for a while, a general manager, and yet, even with all of that experience, he wanted to learn more. I am fascinated by people who have that mindset or that approach towards work and life, because so often we treat our experience and expertise as a signal that we know it all, rather than as a signal that there is more to learn. And so I got curious about his approach and the work that he was doing.
I thought it was interesting about that too, because I'm sadly a Knicks fan, so I've experienced much pain in my life, and I wanted him to be hired by the Knicks, whatever year that was, when he was deciding between the two. And I didn't realize until I read your paper that he had only coached like his sons. I knew he had worked in broadcasting. I remember him shooting around or calling our games when Oliver and I were at Florida. I remember that he worked for the Suns, but I didn't know that he had only coached his son's 7th grade team before he was hired with the Warriors.
Yep.
Yeah.
And again, I can think of so many situations where I have met managers or leaders who are invited into a position and they just roll up their sleeve, they get ready, and they get into action rather than thinking about how can I best prepare for that role. And so his approach seemed different enough that I wanted to go study it and understand it better.
What was the thing that surprised you most when you were looking into him and kind of his time pre and post being hired by the Warriors?
Possibly 2 or maybe 3 things. One is more on the personal side. He's a person who traveled quite a bit around the world. And also, because of his family situations, spent time outside of the United States. And with that came quite a bit of tragedy. His dad was assassinated in Beirut, and he seemed to have figured out, with a lot of grace, a way to use those tragedies to become even more motivated to do good in the world, whatever that meant for him. And so that, to me, again, is very inspiring, since often we run into issues, challenges, failures, or tragedies, and the world gets very dark on us. And somehow he had found a way to use those experiences to better himself. So that was clearly one of them. The second is thoughtfulness, again, in taking on this position. He had, I think, all the rights to say, I'm just going to go in and try my best. And instead, he wanted to learn from coaches who had inspired him over the years, as well as he wanted to get to know his players. So before becoming a coach, he spent a lot of time traveling around the United States to study other coaches, as well as, in a sense, getting to know his players better. And then the third is the approach that you use to set up the team for success. Again, quite thoughtful, quite intentional. And so I loved learning about that.
So I've got to ask, you spent a lot of time watching him and the Warriors. The NBA is in the news a lot this year with a lot of off-court drama. Were you surprised that Draymond Green wasn't suspended?
I was a little bit surprised. It's tough. And this is something that I've learned by writing a lot of case studies in addition to is sometimes the opportunity to learn about people, about teams, about organizations give you just a small slice of the broader context. And so I can think of situations where I was similarly surprised with other leaders and other organizations. So we'll have to see what happens next. Sort of curious about learning more about the specifics of what led to that.
I've got a question to piggyback on the experience and the kind of the tragedy that he'd experienced in his life. How much do you find that leaders who have experienced heavy adversity or tragedy in their lives, how much does that prepare them, or how much does that put them in a situation to be more successful or be more empathetic, I think, when it comes to leading their own organizations?
I think you captured the key to the answer. I think that is quite remarkable to see leaders who have used moments of tragedies to be successful. It happens when, in fact, the tragedy is used as a moment to build more empathy, but also to keep things in perspective. So I have a lot of interviews with coaches and leaders from other organizations that speak to moments that were big failures for them. And especially when the moment of failure was more like a personal moment of tragedy, they look at the current situation or things that are not going well and sort of say, okay, this is a tough problem. But if we put it in perspective, I think we're going to get through it. And so it gives them a different set of lenses that they use to look at the situation, but also a different level of motivation and energy in trying to address it.
Do you come across the opposite of, I guess it's hard because it's hard for you to say, oh, I'm going to go talk to this person who had that happen and fell out of grace and is now, low middle management somewhere instead of being the CEO of X organization. But what do you think makes the difference between the people who face the adversity and then kind of thrive on it? Post-traumatic kind of growth idea versus those that struggle with it and then kind of fall back?
I believe that a big differentiator, and this comes not from research, but anecdotal evidence in thinking about the leaders that comes to mind when you ask that question. I think the big differentiator is, did you pause to make sense of that experience and truly asking yourself, am I learning something? Or you just try to forget about his existence and just move on because it's a moment of pain. So I have met leaders in more traditional organizations that had very high level positions as executives or even CEOs. And then they were asked to resign, or they had to leave, or their company went bankrupt. And so that is a moment of deep personal tragedy and personal failure, but the ones that seems to have spent time with themselves in the forest, as they sometimes refer to the walks that they were taking, trying to sort of make sense of what is this moment teaching me about myself and about my ability to be in the world or to lead, they seem to fare better.
Have you, how does someone learn how to do that, to become self-reflective? Like, I totally agree. I think when I think of sports and business too, the world is so fast-paced, and in the game, sometimes it's just like boom, boom, boom. You could play 4 or 5 games in the NBA in a week. How does someone learn to hit the brakes and be self-reflective in those moments?
Being aware that reflecting is valuable, I think, is important. I did some research with a few colleagues of mine where we were looking at the power of reflection on performance. And in our case, it was in the context of gaining skills on a certain type of task. And what we found is that when you give people the choice, do you want to take time for reflection, or do you want to keep on practicing before performing the high stakes task? Often people want for practicing, or if you tell them, do you want to keep working or do you want to reflect? They want to keep working. And so we have the wrong intuition about the power of reflection. And so I think that the best way to counter that is to acknowledge that our human nature is pushing up in the wrong directions and create time for that self-reflection. So for example, very concretely, I put that as an appointment on my calendar because I know that when it comes to it, I'm going to fill the time in a different way unless I'm serious about the fact that that is necessary.
Very interesting. A lot of your points on Steve Kerr, and not your points, but just exemplifying him, were about, I guess a better way to phrase it is the words you used to describe him or how he worked with the team were compassion, joy, vulnerability, love, learning about each other. Things that, like, you know, when I think of the traditional hard-ass coach back in the day, they would be like, no way, that is not it. Do you think that in the world today, like a coach or a leader can be successful without doing those things that you kind of write about Steve Kerr doing?
I think it's hard, especially in the world of today, not to have that sense of love and compassion. What is interesting about his way of working with his players is that you have 2 important dimensions. One is the caring, love, dedication, devotion, however you want to call it. But on the other side, you have this very high, clear expectations. So everybody on the team or everybody who's working with them know exactly what the expectations are. And so for him is high, clear expectations, but also high and very deep devotions to the player. And I think that when you have both, you're in a really good spot as a coach. When I use that framework in talking about the case, when I teach it to executives or students, I often ask a very simple question. I say, well, let's imagine that I spend time with the people you work with, and I show them this 2x2. I make a joke since HBS professors often think in terms of 2x2, but that aside, I'd explain the framework. And then I said, if I were to ask people who work with you, where would they place you as a way to capture the way they experience you as a coach or as a leader? And it's interesting to see that not a lot of people are in the high category. It's a tough place to be. And many of them have this realization that is almost instant. They're smiling as if I can give you an answer. So when you go to them and say, what are you thinking? They say, well, it depends on who you're asking. So some people will clearly place me here, and some people will place me in a different part of the 2x2. And I think that is deeply interesting, because one of the quotes that Steve Kerr shared with me during one of the interviews as we were working on the case study, and I don't believe he's in the final case, but it's a really great quote. He said, look, let's be honest. Let's be real. As a coach, you're not going to like all of your players equally. You just won't. They're going to like some more than the others. But for sure, you need to make sure that you're giving everybody equal opportunities. I think that is just such a important, interesting insight, because again, if I go back to my executives or my students, we're thinking, well, it depends on who you're asking. What is driving those shifts? And often what you discover is that the reason why some people really experience you as a good coach or as a leader in the high category, those are the people you like. And then the ones you don't like as much end up not getting your attention. And the part that makes me wonder is what's behind that liking. Often is we have a similar approach in the way we do things, or the similar energy. And so that's worrisome, because then you might be coaching or leading in ways that are not quite fair, because it's everything driven by liking. So I think about that quote quite a bit.
I think that's really good. Obviously in my space, representing coaches in the collegiate level, probably more so than the professional level, it's becoming clear that if you are a newer or younger coach, you better have more compassion and energy for these players. Whereas some of these veteran Hall of Famer coaches, they're almost like grandfathered into being able to take a hard line. And I do think for those guys, most of the time, something you hit there was their expectations are clear and they have very, very high expectations. But if you aren't meeting those expectations, you're probably on a harder punishment receiving end than you are in what is perceived as maybe acceptable, or what you can get away with as a coach when you're on the younger side of things, especially with the empowerment of, 18, 19, 20-year-olds have a voice now, and they should have a voice. And there's just more of an effort to provide respect to more of an emphasis to provide respect to all players across the board, where maybe 15, 20 years ago, that was less the case.
But what I also love about your example is that imagine you're that player who is not performing at the high levels you're expected to perform. A coach without compassion might look at you and say, what is wrong with you?
Right.
Why is it that you're not performing at the usual level, or you're not putting in 100%? I think a coach who has compassion is going to have a very different reaction. Is more, let's talk, or what it is that I'm doing that is getting in the way of you being able to be as effective as usual. So it's a very different type of dialogue and conversation.
If you enjoy this podcast, I also write a weekly newsletter sharing the best content I found in the last week that directly applies to coaches. Some of the best coaches in the world subscribe, and it's free. So go to coachingcoaches.substack.com or check out the link in the show notes to subscribe. Once again, that's coachingcoaches.substack.com. Let's get back to the episode. Wife would probably say I'm in the former category many times, but she doesn't listen to this, so it doesn't matter. She doesn't hear it anyway.
I wasn't going to ask.
I told her that she would love listening to you, and her colleagues would too, but she won't listen to me. So she hears enough of my shit during the day, so it's fine. One of I think the biggest questions that I have thought about since starting this podcast, and that kind of came up again in this, is just the idea of survivorship bias with who we're looking at, and the ability of people who have success to then kind of say that, oh, this was why, or I did this. Like, and I'm not saying this against Steve Kerr or anything, like Billy Donovan, who Oliver and I have immense respect for, won 2 national titles. And now he says, you know, he's wants to help people focus on the process and getting better and becoming better versions of themselves. But like, that's easy to say when you're a 2-time national title champion. And it's easy to say for Steve Kerr to talk about coaching with joy when he's coaching Steph Curry, who I'd argue may embody the idea of joy as much as any player like in NBA history. I don't think like when the 76ers were tanking, if you ask Brett Brown, who was their coach, and you know, they're winning like 10 games a year, like talk about like, I don't know how much joy he was talking about. Do you have any thoughts on that in general?
Yeah, it's interesting that part of the way he ended up with the 4 values of compassion, mindfulness, competitiveness, and joy is reflecting on what is valuable to him, but also what will resonate with the players. So I think that joy in particular is the realization that some of the team players would embrace that pretty quickly. But it was also a thoughtful approach to say, look, if we go back to the reason why most players become players in the first place is because of the joy of playing. And somehow, once you have big audiences and big incentives and a lot of pressure, that is an easy one to forget. The work gets serious. I think you can make the parallel outside of sports in all sorts of organizations where you got into the job because of passion, and then the to-do list is getting longer. There is a lot of pressure. There is that promotion. You want to make the cut for your bonus. And so you sort of forget about that passion and joy of just doing the work. And so I think it was a clear signal for him to make sure that this is not forgotten in the day-to-day. It seems to be something that he relies on both in times when they're winning, but also in times where they're struggling. And so it's truly, to me, a good approach to be clear on the values that are driving you, the business, the team, because what research suggests is that when those values are very clear, it's much easier to react to negative events, or it's much easier to pivot. And so in a sense, I think he's setting himself up for success in terms of dealing with tough moments when things are not going as well as before.
What advice would you have for someone, say an assistant coach, who maybe wants to go against the grain a little bit when they just feel like maybe the values are a little different from maybe their own personal values? What advice do you have for a person like that, or, you know, an executive VP underneath a CEO? How do they navigate that and swim against the stream a little bit while still understanding that they've got a job and responsibilities? How can they make an impact in their own way? Do you have any advice for someone like that?
Yeah, I meet a lot of people and a lot of leaders and a lot of employees. Sometimes they refer to them as the rebellious types, who feel that they want to bring in a new idea or push the boundaries in some way or innovate or bring change about their work or their organizations more broadly or their team. And they have so much excitement for what they like to push for that they feel as if they're facing a bifurcation in their choice set. It is, I'm going to push for what I want and for what I think is beneficial, or I want because I really want to make sure that the relationships stay good. And the most successful individuals who get to push for something different are the people who understand that you can do both. You can be respectful for what is there, understanding why certain practices exist, and then push for something different. I think that sometimes our excitement for ideas that we have or changes that we want to bring about, we feel so strongly about the need for it that we come across as arrogant in pushing for the change.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah. No, I see how that happens. And I mean, I think with going back to the joy comment about Steve Kerr, like what was it, 3 years ago when they were one of the worst teams in the NBA, and he had to put up with that and the health issues he had, and to kind of keep joy front and center in those, it made it through the bad times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. I do believe, and in a sense, the pandemic has been a good demonstration of that when the values are really clear and they're genuinely the values that you want to stand for, it's much easier to go through tougher times.
So you mentioned those people who are the rebellious type, and there happens to be a very good book I've read about that called Rebel Talent that you may or may have not written. So why, we talked about Kerr, but what led you to kind of write, study, learn about the rebellious types, and would Harvard put you in that category?
That's very funny. I'll answer the first question first. Some people ask the question a little differently. They say, how is it that you can be rebellious in a conservative place like Harvard? So those are very interesting conversations. But to your first place, why this book? I have always been interested in people who break rules. But for a long part of my career, I was looking at situations where you break the rules and you end up in trouble because you're probably doing something that is not fitting with the policies or not even good from a moral standpoint. But as I was collecting stories and examples and doing the research, I had noticed that there are lots of people who break rules with positive outcomes. Yeah. And a great example of that truly gave me the inspiration for the book was an Italian chef. He is now the owner of a restaurant that is one of the best restaurants in the world. It's an Italian restaurant, so moment of pride here for my Italian roots. His name is Massimo Bottura. And what was interesting about him is that he went into a context, traditional Italian dishes, and decided to reinvent them. So he came up with very innovative spins about traditional Italian dishes. And as an Italian, I could sense the difficulty of what he was trying to do. Like, we have also theories about Italians, some true, some wrong, but two things are for sure true. One is that we cherish our traditions, especially when it comes to grandmother's recipes that have been passed on for centuries. And second, we have a lot of rules when it comes to cooking. We might not care about where you park legally or not, or whether you're speeding, doesn't matter. But when it comes to cooking, we're super serious about the rules, from the way you need to have certain type of sauces for certain type of pasta. I'm married to an American, and to this date, my husband doesn't understand why is it that every time that he has pasta with a fish-based sauce, he can't put Parmesan cheese on top of it. It's wrong. It's against the rules. You can't do it. And so here you have a person who went into that context and started asking a lot of questions. Why is it that we cook dishes this way? Maybe it made sense 20 years ago, but not today. And so he came up with something truly innovative. That was inspiring because he brought about change and innovation in a context where it was difficult to do. And so I got really curious about trying to understand who are these rebellious types, what are they doing, and what could I learn from them so that I can apply some of the same ideas into my own life.
Do you feel like the whatever personality test there is, there's the disagreeableness trait. Do you feel like the people you define as rebels score high in that trait?
That's interesting.
I feel like, and I'm gonna butcher this, but I'll be directionally correct. But I feel like Malcolm Gladwell wrote a piece about a doctor who was trying to find. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, tell me about the story.
He was trying, and I'm going to have to go back and figure out what book it was from, or if it was one of his articles online, but it was like a doctor who was trying to find some way to help children when they have cancer. And in order to do so, he had to go and do things that were just like brutally hard on him to do, to like witness, to do with the kids, and other people wouldn't do it with him because it was just so like rough and hard to do. and he just decided to do it all on his own. And now he's known as like the guy who helped figure out XYZ to help with that process. But to me, it just seems like the people who are rebels or kind of would fall into that bucket from afar.
It's interesting. If there were traits that I would associate with the rebels, probably their superpower is curiosity, is this ability not to take things for granted, but asking, could we do better or could we do differently? And I think that that is a very healthy approach. Part of the reason why I decided to write the book is that I kept going into organizations or talking to leaders and employees. And for a while, I took on a very strange hobby where I would go in with very cynical set of eyes. I told myself, I'm going to go in and try to pay real close attention to the ways of working in these organizations or processes or systems, and point to the ones that, to the eyes of a person who doesn't work them, they seem to be a little bit strange, inefficient. And then I would ask questions about those very processes to the people who worked in the organization. And what surprised me was not necessarily the existence of the processes itself and the fact that they made little sense in a lot of situations, but is the answer that I was getting when I asked the question, why is it that you do things this way? The answer was always, we've always done it that way. And so is this realization that, again, you're looking at traditional Italian dishes and just saying, okay, let's continue, rather than saying, but why is it that we did it that way? And does it make sense today? Could we approach it differently? That's curiosity. It's sort of the why, let me understand. Is there a different way? So I feel that curiosity is a great superpower of effective rebels.
So let's say I get hired by the Knicks tomorrow to run their team, and I'm looking at different processes they've had over time, and I think that there's room for improvement in XYZ area. What advice do you have for me on bringing that up to a superior, a peer, whoever that person is, without coming across like it's a kind of criticism against themselves, or how them and that team has done that for how many ever years?
I was recently talking to a person who has a lot of lived experience in driving innovation in large organizations. And he shared an insight that I think captured better than anything else that I was trying to write in the book the message that I wanted to convey. He said, often we pitch ideas when we want to drive change or when we want to be innovative. We should pitch outcomes instead. And I thought that was brilliant, because what you're going to have on the other side, as you're trying to be creative or change practices, is people who are very used to those practices. Change is hard. Whenever we think about change, we think about what it is that we're going to lose by moving away from the current practice or way of working. And when I think we pitch outcomes, we're focusing the attention on the potential of a gain. And so I think that the appetite of it is going to be very different. And when I think about rebellious types that in my mind have been not only very constructive, but very successful, they were pitching outcomes. They had that vision for what they wanted to achieve, and they made it real for others as well.
I think that's so good. In talking about, in your book, you talk about flight attendants and almost the like mundane role of here's the script, and they probably do that 1,000 times a year, and this is what it is. And then you talk about another company, a competitor of the majority of the industry, and they do things a little differently. And talk about some of the risks in that, and kind of unpack that a little for us, like traditional flight attendants versus what Southwest has done.
Yeah, I was very struck by the many hours spent on flights going around the world. I was very surprised by my own behavior, where you have these people who clearly have important jobs, and they're delivering safety announcement that can be quite helpful in moments of crisis. And what I started doing almost unconsciously is, as soon as they start talking, I just pay no attention. So I started reading my notes or thinking about where I'm going, but clearly not paying attention to what is being said. And to me, it was a great realization of the fact that from the perspective of the airline, their goal is to make sure that passengers know what to do in moments of crisis. And I wasn't the only one checking out. So clearly we're not hearing the message. But then you can look at it from the perspective of the flight attendants. You have, I don't know, 100, 150 people in front of you. Clearly nobody is giving you your attention. And so it seemed a missed opportunity there. And what I found is that companies who go about this a little bit differently, they truly understand that what's important is be clear on the goal, but then more flexible on the how we get there. You can give more ownership, in this case, to the person delivering the safety message, such that they can do it with their own flair. And so at Southwest, you might have a person who loves to sing, and so they sing the safety announcement to you. Or maybe you have a person who's particularly interested in improv comedy and jokes, and so they bring a little bit of humor. Now you have my attention. And now they're also happier because clearly they have passengers on the planes that are listening to the message. But more broadly, from an organizational standpoint, given that the goal is for passengers to be safe, you reach that goal more in a more likely way and more successfully if you, in fact, give more flexibility on the how.
How do you, in the climate we live in now, get comfortable with giving someone that space to do the how, knowing that, I mean, I have no idea how many like flight attendants Southwest has, but like obviously, God forbid one of them says the wrong thing, someone's pulling out a camera, it's going viral on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, everything. And then, you know, you got to deal with a fire. Like to me, and maybe I'm just a tight ass, but like my inclination would be like, I'd rather just have the rules and tell you exactly the how, so I don't have to deal with that, one, risk, and two, like pain in the behind fire to fight down the road.
Yeah, risky. I can see the red flags popping into your mind. What I think is beautiful about what you asked about is the fact that the people who are successful in being clear on the what, but then the how as flexibility, are people who are also very, very, very clear. In fact, I would say 300% clear on what the non-negotiables are. And the non-negotiables are generally principles. So you have the space to deliver the safety message the way you want. But let's make sure that we are never rude, or let's make sure that we never use this set of words, or let's make sure that we're always centered on making the customers at ease. Whatever that is, I think that the problem is that often we don't discuss those non-negotiables.
Yeah.
We have no clue what they are. And so you're left to your own devices in terms of action on that front.
No, that's a way to put it that's helpful, I think, for a lot of people in those situations who may find themselves similar to me, where you're inclined to not do that. But I think that's really helpful.
I'll give you a concrete story, and it comes from a context where I think you would expect zero rebelliousness, because it's a very heavily regulated context, highly hierarchical, very bureaucratic. The culture is all about not rocking the boat. So this is a real group in the Air Force. They're called Squadron 99. And what they do, most of the people working there are pilots. They fly spy planes. So imagine these beautiful planes going 70,000 feet above the ground to take pictures for intelligence that are used in other parts of the government. And a new leader came in a few years back. His nickname is Chaos, but he gets that for other reasons. He's a very effective leader. But he came in and said, look, if we want to be true to our mission, for them is to be combat ready, we need to do things differently. Truly, you need to own your problems, go solve them. Let's figure it out such that we're best prepared for the future. But in addition to doing that, it defined the non-negotiables. And for them are the regulations. Everything, new ideas, you create these ways of working, always within regulations. And in fact, he asked everyone in the group to go and study regulations. I've never met pilots that can spell out to you so many regulations and details of the regulations that affect their work. But then if you look at the outcome, what came out of that approach is pretty impressive. They do contracting like the private sector more than the public sector, or pilots who knew nothing about software development, developed apps that are used during the flight that increase the safety. They won a $94 million grant that allowed them to look at data in a very different way. And that came out of one leader who understood that he had influence over his group, and he decided to define the boundaries, the non-negotiables, but then acted in a way that allowed for people to embrace a little bit more freedom.
Yeah, that is not an area. I was trying to think of what I expected you to talk about, and the most rigid I could think of that would like fit was like nurses in a hospital, like, you know, dressing in different colored scrubs or something, not, you know, spy pilots. So that's super interesting. I have to ask you to share the story about one of Oliver's former colleagues who happened to sing a national anthem, and kind of how you came across that story and what lessons you took from it.
What a great stories. Yeah, so we go back to 2003.
Yeah.
A great moment where this coach, Maurice Cheeks, found himself in this large arena, as you well know, for a really important game. It was game 3 of the 2003 NBA championship. And what is beautiful about that moment is thinking as if you're in the shoes of this coach. Important game, you have 20,000 fans, you have millions of viewers ready to watch the game from home. And like, I don't know, you tell me, since you're closer to that environment, but probably you're incredibly focused on how is it that you're going to lead your team to success. You're thinking through the strategy and the tactics. And right before the game started, a girl who was about 13 years old in age comes in middle of the arena to sing the national anthem. She starts, and by the time she gets to the second line, she doesn't remember the words. And within milliseconds, Coach Maurice Cheeks comes into the scene and starts singing alongside her. Every time she has trouble and she loses confidence, he's the one putting the microphone closer to her mouth. I often use the real clip from that moment. I show it to my students or to executives or leaders I'm teaching or talking to. And the question that I ask coming out of that clip is the following. And I say, does this coach have a good voice? And people are sort of puzzled in the way they look at me. And I was like, let's be honest, it doesn't. In fact, during the song, he didn't remember the words either. But it doesn't matter. So he basically chose to put himself in a real situation of vulnerability. And we might think of it as a bad idea. In fact, I can list a lot of leaders who believe that being vulnerable is bad. And yet, at the end of the song, everybody's singing. Everybody's applauding. And it's a beautiful example of how when we embrace vulnerability, people get to see that we're human. And so there is a connections that happen much more easily. So to me, it was such a beautiful moment. And it comes from a person who, the girl was not on his team. So how do you develop that capacity to intervene so quickly with vulnerability, to have empathy and help others? I often think about the following. I say, okay, let's imagine it was me. So it wasn't Maurice Cheeks, but it's Francesca Gino in that arena. I think that I would sit down and say, okay, I see the opportunity, but let's think through the cost of doing this and the benefit. So we have the cost on one side, benefits on the other, which list is longer, and then I intervene. And he didn't do any of that. It was just natural for him. He just walked in and helped. Beautiful example of the power of authenticity, the power of vulnerability.
I think in knowing Mo personally and having spent 4 or 5 years with him in Oklahoma City, he is one of those guys that he doesn't take himself too seriously. And I think the quote was in the book too, like, he's a parent. He saw a kid that was struggling, and he would hope that someone would go do the same for his kid. And that's really true to who Mo is. He's just a stand-up normal guy and just happened to be in a huge situation, but acted how he would if there were 10 people out there rather than 20,000 people. It was definitely a beautiful moment. And it's true to him. It's who he is.
Yeah, I love the fact that you were saying that despite the fact there was so much attention on him in the moment, he didn't even think twice. He just acted because that's who I am. Beautiful.
That was good.
19 years later, we're talking about it. I just checked on YouTube. It's got like 1 million views. And listeners, if you have been living under a rock for 19 years and don't know what we're talking about, I'll include a link in the show notes so you can watch it, because it really is a beautiful moment. And I think an example of, which I didn't think this is where we'd go with this, but like what we as a society need a lot more of these days is just someone needs something and we're there to help them and not judge them or say they're not with me and I'm not that sort of thing. But anyway, we got a lot of problems to deal with in society, so that's just one of them. Lots
of opportunities. That's how I think about them.
Yes. So speaking of opportunities, and a lot of our listeners are quote unquote leading their groups into battle, whether that's a big game or a draft experience or an opportunity like that. One other story you write about in the book is with Napoleon, and he's leading his troops into battle, and kind of it's like an uphill situation, and he comes up with a way to inspire that group. Could you talk a little about that story?
Absolutely. And there are all sorts of stories about Napoleon Bonaparte and the way he dealt with power. But the one that stood out to me was his ability to be in the trenches. Many people with this type of role at the time were staying in the castle, if you will, leading and waiting for the soldiers and the troops to hopefully win. And instead, he was the one talking to them at night, but also showing up in the same battlefield. And I thought that was a great parallel with leaders who I think are very influential in their work and they're very successful and they keep their feet on the ground. So it's not that because of their title, certain jobs are not for them anymore, but rather they show that they're in with the team, taking on roles and responsibilities that maybe others won't expect. So for example, for a more modern example, when I was visiting Osteria Francescana, one of the things that really struck me was I arrived on site at the restaurant. 9 a.m. comes about and Chef Massimo Bottura shows up. And the first thing that he does is runs to get his white chef coat, puts it on, and then he grabs the broom and goes outside to clean the street in front of the restaurant. And you get to see everybody else on the team was like, what is he doing? But then the second question is, why is it that I'm not the one with the broom? And so everybody picks up the broom and go and cleans the street, or is the first one to jump on the trucks, the delivery trucks, to get stuff off the truck. And so it's not that because of his status and role, he's the chef and owner of now a really famous restaurant. It's not that some roles are not for him. He's in committed as much as everybody else on the team. I think that is just beautiful.
I love it. I love it.
It's a good one. Is there anything else you're thinking about as we close the year here in December 2022?
I am thinking a lot, as you mentioned, about where we are in the world right now. And so I feel like if there was a moment to embrace a lot of the things that I've learned from Steve Kerr, this is kind of it. I think that if we take the values that he had for the team, and yes, let's be competitive, let's be ambitious about whatever it is that we want to achieve. But let's not forget about the joy of doing the work. And let's not forget about being mindful and also being compassionate. I think that the world is going to be much better if we embrace those ideas.
I think that is a beautiful place to leave it. If people want to learn more about you, we're going to link the book in the show notes, but where else can they go?
I am the happiest whenever ideas that I share are actually put into practice. And so find me on LinkedIn, drop me an email. I am on a few social media platforms. Or if you want to learn more about Rebel Talent, get the book, go to the website, take the test and see what kind of rebels you are. And for those of you who are going to take that route, if you become a pirate, it's a very good thing.
Well, awesome. We'll link the LinkedIn in the show notes and the book. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a blast.
It was such a great conversation. Thank you, you two.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Coaching Coaches Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and receive our world-class newsletter in your inbox every Sunday. You can access both of those at coachingcoaches.co. Once again, that's coachingcoaches.co.